Hello, welcome to my talk. I'm glad to be here in person. This is actually my first live conference talk because I did a pre-recorded one last year, and it's not quite the same. So I'm really excited for the opportunity to be here with all of you in like an actual room. So you might be here because you saw the title of this talk, RailsConf equals demo, and something about it intrigued you. Or maybe you just picked a room at random. I don't actually know why you're here. But either way, let's just unpack this title. So what it refers to is the environment variable used to control the mode that your Rails app boots up in. Now, by default, this is actually going to be development or test if you're running your tests, or if you're deploying to production, hopefully you're using the production environment. And some companies actually have a staging environment, but that's not one of the built-ins. So out of the box, what you get are the big three: development, production, and test. And of course, these environments correspond to config files, and these config files have actual config content in them, like what makes that environment unique. And I mean, I'm talking to a room full of Rails engineers, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, because what I'm going to be talking about today is, at its core, the idea of adding a new dedicated environment called demo for giving, well, application demos. Like the ability to step up in front of an audience and show off a live version of your product reliably and repeatedly and consistently. Because the last thing you want is to get up there and for something to go horribly wrong. So think of this a little bit like the showroom floor model of your application, or maybe the Walmart GameCube kiosk version of your app, except without the horrible neck strain. And I wish I could say that it were as simple as just adding a new demo.rb file to your app, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because demoability, the ability to quickly take something that you've been building and show it off to the world, is about a lot more than just the way that you boot up your application. So this is actually something that I and my team have been thinking about and iterating on for almost 6 years. We've been exploring this iceberg of demoability. And so who am I? Well, let me introduce myself. So my name is Nathan. I exist online in a few places. I also exist in real life, and I work at a company called Betterment. So you might have heard of us. We offer financial advice, investing accounts, retirement, you name it. I like to say that our top product is financial peace of mind, and I should mention that we're hiring. And so I work on the application platform team at Betterment. We focus on a lot of cross-cutting concerns, and we provide our product teams with more of a day-to-day peace of mind. But I haven't always worked on this team. And so the story I want to tell starts in 2016, when I first joined Betterment. Back then, I was on a different team, helping build Betterment's 401k offering, which is now part of Betterment at Work. And so while most people think of Betterment as a B2C business, like financial services for everyday people like me and all of you and my parents, the thing that my team was building was actually a B2B product, because our customers were companies who might want to offer 401k plans to their employees, who would then get the Betterment consumer experience. And look, I'm not on the business side of things, I'm just a software engineer, but if there's one thing I know about B2B businesses, it's that they do a lot of product demos. And so we found ourselves in a position where we really wanted to show off Betterment's consumer product to all of our new and prospective business clients. And so how did we do that? So firstly, there's always the option to just use the production app, right? In our case, it's actually a cluster of multiple relatively monolithic applications, so not microservices, but also not one big Rails app. But since our app involves real money and real personal info, this option didn't feel great. And so we looked around and we saw that Betterment also had a staging environment. It was deployed in exactly the same overall configuration as production, except that the database was reset and repopulated nightly with some magical sanitized staging data. And so we said, okay, what if we do something like that? And if this sounds a bit like step 1, draw 2 circles, step 2, draw the owl, it's because that's exactly what this is. You see, if what you need is a drawing of an owl, but somebody else is already drawing owls for you, then you don't need to learn how to draw the owl. And so the staging environment was our owl. Of course, we made a couple modifications to it. For instance, we didn't need all of that sanitized staging data, so we added another process to just sort of populate the database with some demo accounts. But as for the rest of it, we just copy-pasted the deployment scripts, the environment file, everything that made staging staging. And we deployed it. And it worked. Or so we thought. But fast forward a bit to 2017, and we were still hard at work on our roadmap, but we were getting a sense that the demo environment wasn't really all that reliable. In fact, we were being told directly, again and again, in no uncertain terms, that the demo environment was not reliable. And it just kept breaking for all sorts of reasons. And eventually, getting it working was just too much for us. And so we effectively gave up, and it felt bad. And by 2018, we knew that we had truly failed because the Slack messages had stopped entirely. Teams had found other ways of giving product demos. And I saved this screen grab of our build history. And I can tell that this is really old because we don't use Jenkins anymore. And if you look closely, it's actually an entire year's worth of broken builds. So each one of those was a developer banging their head against their keyboard, trying to get this thing working. And so thinking back to that iceberg of demoability, we had already made our first big observation right beneath the surface, which is that deploying a demo environment is not the same thing as maintaining a demo environment. And so by 2019, the business needs had really caught up with us again, and we needed this thing to be working. But we also finally had time in our roadmap. And so this time we wanted to build something that was easier to maintain in the long run. And so we started just like writing down a list of the things that the original demo environment had consisted of. So firstly, what got deployed? Well, everything. All of our apps. And secondly, the database was populated up front with all of those demo accounts, right? So I would call that seed or fixture data. And then to keep that data fresh, the entire database was reset with every deployment. So it relied on these short-lived databases. And then at first, we deployed this thing only on Sundays, but that got to be a little painful. So we switched to monthly deploys. And when that got too painful, we just started deploying only when we needed to. And so I would call that push button, but it was really push button and cross fingers. And lastly, who owned it? Well, us. The engineering team closest to the need for its existence and most incentivized to do the work. And so now that we had this list, we just started crossing things out, starting with this idea of deploying an entire cluster of services. Because from a maintainability standpoint, why keep a bunch of apps running if what we really care about is one app, like the thing that we really wanted to demo? And so that got us thinking, because at Betterment, we already have a way of running our Rails apps in isolation from one another. It's how we run them on our local development laptops. And so when we develop apps locally, we use a tool called WebValve. And what WebValve lets us do is define fake versions of all of our collaborating services, and it will automatically route all web traffic to those fakes. So it's actually built on top of WebMock and Sinatra, if you're familiar with those Ruby gems. And so instead of running an entire cluster of applications locally and connecting to external sandbox APIs and that kind of thing, we have a set of fakes which actually run inside the Ruby process itself. So it's all one Rails app. And so these fake apps are really simple. They don't have to do everything that a real app would. They just have to respond with some fake data so that your app doesn't break. And now there's a whole other talk on WebValve itself, and our VP of architecture, Sam, does a great job of summarizing how it can be useful for local development and testing. And so I'm not going to cover that here. And if you're interested, you can find it and more on GitHub. But what I will cover is how we got all of this working in our local demo environment. And so firstly, it did allow us to actually deploy just a single app, basically for free, because it relied on all of the fake services that our teams had already written in local development. And so right off the bat, this was great. But remember that we were stubbing out all of those collaborating services, so basically all outside HTTP requests. And so I showed this to one of my colleagues who commonly gave client demos, and he clicked around and he liked what he was seeing, but then he encountered this page. So this is supposed to show a graph of the performance history of an account. And he said, hold on, I can't show this to clients. And I was like, well, we don't actually have any performance history because this is just a demo app, and the history comes from a different backend service, and blah, 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 developer talk. And he said, doesn't matter. If a client has to ask why something looks broken, then the demo is already off track. And so I walked away from that meeting feeling pretty bummed because he was right, and I knew I was just making excuses for technical shortcomings. And so I started to wonder if this whole WebValve approach was even the right idea. But I thought about it some more, because like most of the application worked as intended. It was just some of these external service boundaries that didn't make for a good demo. And so I thought, okay, why not just make the fake service a little more fake? And by that I mean, why not write a fake stock market simulation with buys and sells and market changes and dividends and fees? And of course, none of this is actually real and based in any kind of reality, because this is a terrible simulation and you shouldn't use it for anything. But it resulted in this graph. Again, is this real? No, absolutely not. But is it demoable? Maybe. And so I went back to my colleague, and he said, yeah, sure, looks great. And so at that point, I decided, OK, we can probably run with this. And so we did, and there were maybe one or two other places where we had to fill in the gaps like this. But there was one more big issue, which was these fake services had no ability to remember anything. And by that I mean, if you performed an action, like make a deposit, which resulted in an external post request, the next time you fetch your balance via an external GET request, it would show your previous balance. So again, this was going to break immersion. And so this is where we came up with the idea of stateful fakes. So a stateful fake is a WebValve fake that can remember things. It gets its own database tables and active record models, and it can read from those tables during GET requests, and during POST requests, it can actually update those tables. And so now it can remember things. And so you could deposit $123 into an account, and then see it actually reflected in the balance of that account. And so we'd done it. We could demo our application in total isolation from any other apps and services. And so instead of deploying multiple apps, we had just one app with stateful fakes. And we'd also made our second observation in the iceberg of demoability, which is that an app should mostly work in isolation. Like, it might need some massaging at the system boundaries, but if we want an app to be easily demoable, it should mostly make sense on its own. And thankfully, ours did. So next, we focused our attention on the way that we populate the demo data and accounts. And so we crossed that out too. But then we thought, OK, if we're not using seeds or fixture data, like if we don't actually populate user accounts ahead of time, then what do we do? Like, how else are you going to log in? You'll be faced with this form, and you'll need to enter something, right? Well, the more we thought about this, the more we realized how awkward this must already be for our client-facing teams. Like, did they just keep a sticky note with demo logins on it? And how did they know that somebody else wasn't already using one of these accounts? And so if it's so awkward, why are we using the login form at all? And that was our aha moment. And so we sketched out something totally different on a whiteboard. A page where you're presented with like 3 different users, each with a sign-in button. And we thought to ourselves, OK, what if when you click sign in, instead of logging in as a specific user account, it spins out some kind of background process and generates a new user for you on the fly? And so you'd see a brief loading spinner, but then you'd be dropped straight into a totally fresh dashboard. This felt way less awkward than the login page and like having to use sticky notes. We just needed to figure out how to dynamically create user accounts on the fly. And again, when we looked to our local development environments, we saw that we were already doing this, because when writing our tests, we were using factories. And so at Betterment, we use a tool called FactoryBot by our friends at Thoughtbot. And FactoryBot lets you define factories, like this user factory, which describes how to generate a user. And then you can use the factory to generate as many users as you want. And so this was great. We could easily wire this up to our sign-in button. Plus, you can define things like traits, like a user with a Roth 401k account. And then you just apply those traits at creation time. And so this was actually perfect, because each user type could get its own factory definition, and by just changing up the traits, we could change up the actual dashboard that you drop into. And so to support this, we came up with this quick little domain-specific language, or DSL, for defining these things, and we called them personas. And all you had to do was drop your factory code right in there, and it would take care of the rest. And so again, we took these persona definitions, and we built the actual user interface. And so we had our persona picker. And we made this replace the login page entirely. And it worked. So there's the loading spinner, and that should take us straight into the dashboard. Bingo. But there was just one hiccup. So this was working for us for a while, but then we redeployed something, and suddenly it broke. Darn. So this was giving us flashbacks, right? But then we dug in a bit, and what we found was that after the initial deployment, we could generate user 1, user 2, user 3, and so on, and they'd work just fine. But when we redeploy, the next user we generate would reset back to user 1. And so this would fail against uniqueness constraints in our database or uniqueness validations on the models because user 1's email, among other things, was already taken. And if you look back at the way that factories are defined, you see that we rely on this sequence feature to generate unique sequences for us, so unique emails and so on. And the problem here is, again, it has no memory, this time no long-term memory, because the sequences reset every time the Ruby process or the server restarts. So apologies to our friends at Thoughtbot, but we decided to patch FactoryBot so that it could actually look up the next value in the sequence by checking the database. And at first we were like, okay, let's take the maximum value in the table, like select max of the column name and add 1. And if it's an integer column or a string with some sort of standard lexicographic order, it kind of works, but not really. Because here's a sequence that goes in descending order. And here's a sequence where the attribute is actually encrypted at rest. So there's just no way with SQL to select for the max value in these columns. And there are a few ways to solve for this. I'd say that we went with the best worst option, which is to use an exponential search function to search the space of possible values and then find the next gap in the sequence. And it was a little slow, but not that slow. And we only had to do it once, right? Because once you find the starting value, the sequence can just keep going from there. And of course, we called it clever sequence because clever code is not necessarily good code, and we wanted to remind ourselves of that. But it helped us get to a demoable state. And then, again, that's what mattered. And so now it worked for real. And we could actually use it in real product demos. And so we had another iceberg reveal. This time, the takeaway was that we needed to start with the user experience and work backwards from there. Our first demo environment was built on the faulty assumption that the login page was the right user experience. And by rethinking that assumption, we were able to do away with seeds and fixtures in favor of the new personas framework, powered by factories. And we could have stopped there, right? Like we had this whole thing working end to end, but we're not done crossing out this list. So we decided to keep going. So let's look at this short-lived databases idea. And this one's really easy to cross out because if you remember, we had this process that would basically destroy and recreate the demo database with every deploy. But the only reason we needed this was because of those pre-populated seeds and fixtures, right? And so we needed to keep resetting them in order to keep them fresh. But we had personas now. And so if we just didn't reset the database ever and kept it around indefinitely, all of the demo functionality would still work as intended. And it'd be easier to maintain because it had fewer moving parts. We just had to make sure that we ran all of the necessary schema migrations over time, just like we do in production. And so that was easy. We can go ahead and replace that with a long-lived database that runs schema migrations. And so next up was the cadence of deployments. And we crossed this out, and if you remember, I said that the longer the cadence, the more painful it got. And there's a simple reason for this. It's because whenever something goes wrong, the way to debug it is to look into every change that has happened since the last successful deploy. And so if you haven't deployed in 3 months, you have to sift through 3 months of changes to figure out what broke. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, but if you deploy all the time, then when something goes wrong, you only have 1 or 2 things that might have caused it. And so if it sounds like I'm making a case for continuous integration and continuous deployment, it's because I am. So this is how we build our production apps at Betterment, and so it made sense to just do the same thing for demo. Of course, with continuous deploys, you need to actually operate and monitor the thing so that you know when something breaks. And so we enabled Slack alerts, and we made sure that errors would flow into our bug tracker. And both of these things can then feed into our team's on-call processes. And then the last bit that we were missing was over there on the CI side, testing. And so we wrote tests, and we stuck them in our standard test suite. We actually made it possible to toggle the personas mode on and off using an environment variable, and then the test itself would click through an actual product demo, starting with the personas page. And so if a test failed, a developer would see a red PR build, and they would know that they broke an actual customer demo or sales pitch. And they can't merge until they make it green. And with that, we were running the entire CI/CD infinity loop with our demo application. And so instead of push-button deploys, we were deploying continuously and really benefiting from it, just like in our production environment. And that's actually the next iceberg observation. I would argue that the demo environment is a kind of production environment. Because if you're running live sales demos, like in front of real audiences, then that's a production app, and it deserves production-like uptime guarantees. And so we've made it to the last item in the list, the question of who owns this thing. And I think we can cross this out without any more slides, because we can just look at the things we've already done above. So for one, we're using these stateful fakes, which teams already write when developing and testing apps locally. And for demo personas, we're using factories, which again, teams already produce when they're writing their tests. And then we have this long-lived database that depends on migrations, which teams are already writing when they build features. And plus, we're following the CI/CD process that routes any build failures or issues through to the team closest to the change being made. And so the problem of ownership, of who owns this thing, is kind of immaterial, because the real question is who maintains it. And it's effectively maintained by everyone. And so this list has gotten kind of messy, so let's just rewrite it. And there we go. That's our demo environment 2.0, an isolated app centered around personas, utilizing a long-lived database and deployed continuously. And as a result of all of the tools that we use in our day-to-day work, it was maintained by everyone. And that leads into our final observation, which is simply that, like, incentives matter. I know it might sound a little obvious, even cliche, but it's actually what this talk has secretly been about all along. Because thinking back to 2016 and that first demo environment, we had a team building Betterment's consumer-facing product, focused on their own roadmap and goals, and they had no reason to maintain a demo environment. Plus, we had this B2B engineering team who owned the demo environment for a consumer product that they weren't really building. And then finally, we had a non-engineering team who desperately needed the demo environment to give demos, but who quickly learned not to trust it. And so we had 3 completely misaligned teams with misaligned incentives. But with this new demo environment, when we meet developers where they are with tools that they use every day, like WebValve and FactoryBot, and when we codify the needs of our stakeholders with automated tests and alerting and with abstractions like personas, and then when we focus on the user experience for our demo-giving users and ensure that they have reliable uptime guarantees, we have a set of teams with the agency, expertise, mutual trust, and incentives to maintain this environment together. And so we shipped this in 2020. And as we all know, it's been at least 6, 7 years since then. I don't know, I stopped counting. But to close this out, I wanted to share what we've done in the years since this released. So firstly, we actually ended up launching versions of this for our 3 customer-facing products. So each of these is a different Rails app with its own set of stateful fakes and personas. Second, we also launched a version of this for our internal testing purposes. So teams have added like a zillion test personas, which I've scribbled out so that you can't see them. But any Betterment employees have access to this and can test run the app with any persona. And then we paired this with a developer CLI so that devs can generate personas in their local environments. And in fact, this ended up replacing user seeds entirely, which cut down a bunch on the time it takes to reset our local databases. And lastly, we also connected a test build of our mobile app to a Rails API backed by the same set of personas. And so this is the same loading indicator that drops you straight into a dashboard. And so now, talk about aligning incentives. We've been joined by PMs, designers, mobile engineers, and many other stakeholders across the company, all of whom are relying on this new demo environment and on this shared language of personas to collaborate and iterate on the Betterment product. And the internal usage of these demo apps has really only gone up over time. And so now it's 2022, and as you can see, my disembodied face has made it all the way here to RailsConf Portland. And Betterment still has our demo application. And as you can see, not much has changed, except, wait a minute. Yep, that's right. So this is a real demo embedded right in my slide deck. It'd be ironic if I gave a talk about giving demos without giving at least a little demo. So we can click over here on this when it shows up, the C performance link. And there's our stock market simulator, still running today. And so if I come over here to the log out, and we're right back at our persona picker. So if this persona picker is something that you would want for your application, I am excited to announce that we've actually open sourced it along with our demo framework. And so we've called the gem demo mode. It's available on Ruby gems and on GitHub, where you'll find instructions for setting it up. Basically, it's a mountable Rails engine. So you just drop it into your app, you define a couple personas, and then you launch your app in demo mode. And you can pair it with WebValve if you want, but you don't have to. And you can use FactoryBot if you want, but you don't have to if you have other ways of generating user accounts. And of course, you can use your own logos and branding and that kind of thing. Oh, and before I forget, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all of my teammates over the years who helped make everything you saw possible. And that's all I have for you. So I've posted a copy of these slides at the link on this slide. And if you enjoyed this talk and want to chat more, or if you're interested in learning more about demo mode or WebValve or any of our other open source gems, come find me afterwards or reach out to me online. And it looks like I have a couple minutes left for questions. So if anyone has any questions, this is where I pause awkwardly and wait to see if you raise your hand. Yeah, great question. So the question is kind of what's the overhead of maintaining those fake services with WebValve? My answer to that would be, with WebValve, you don't really want to build like the fully featured version of that collaborating service. You're really focused on what the actual API contract is with that service. And I think we found that in practice, those API contracts don't really change that much. Like a lot of it's additive, so like as you're building features, your developers, when they're building those features locally, might be adding new endpoints and that kind of thing. But yeah, the idea of like a stateful fake is sort of intended to be just like a little bit of massaging to make sure that you can get through like a single demo. It's not intended to be like a fully functioning version of that app that like somehow runs on its, in a little Sinatra DSL, if that makes sense. Yeah, so the question is like, did we explore or think about basically taking the production stack but rerouting it, pointing it to some demo data at the data layer? We also thought about something similar like at the kind of HTTP layer, randomly taking like a demo account and routing it to some sandbox app or something. And so, yeah, so great question. My answer there is like, step one, I think, is actually getting to the point where you can test in production. And that's something I'm actually really interested in kind of exploring at Betterment, is making sure that like we can start to test more of these things in production, maybe get rid of the staging environment entirely. I think once you've gotten to the point where you're testing in production, demoing in production isn't that far past that. But what I would say is when you're optimizing for demoability, one thing you're optimizing for is the consistency of the experience of the people who are giving the demos. And so that's something I have to put more thought into, because I suspect that actually like doing the way we're doing and kind of like stubbing stuff as close to that context as possible gives us much more control over what the the salespeople end up being able to show off when they walk into a room. I'm actually over time, so I'm going to stay up here if you want to come up and ask me any more questions. But I don't want to keep you all from lunch. And so thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.